shall be delving into Reddit's famous subreddit called r/NoSleep, where users post their true stories. And today I have chosen one called I am a phony paranormal investigator, and I put it into this book. You can see the printed pages, but I've just printed it out. The credit is down in the description. Please do check them out. But without further wasting of time, I think we should get into this story. I would like you to relax as best you can. And this may be a bit longer, but I hope you enjoy either way. I am a phony paranormal investigator, and I'm in over my head. Posted on r/NoSleep by user Zenru45. Okay. Yes, I am a phony, but not a shyster, nor a con man. I have never tricked anyone out of their money, really. Given there aren't any confined formal standards for what constitutes as a paranormal investigator, phony is a relative term. I did have a genuine interest in the paranormal as a skeptic before all the madness. I've watched videos on YouTube about unexplained events, ghost phenomena, haunting psychology, and occult symbology. I don't believe any of it to be real. I just thought it was cool. It was a hobby. I just wanted it to be clear. I have never intended to do any harm. In fact, the opposite is true. I wanted to help, and that's how I fell into this job. Apologies for the opening rant. I just wanted to make sure that was clear from the get-go. My name is, well, let's go with Peter, and my real job was a building inspector. Yeah, I'm that guy that everyone hates because I have to tell them that they didn't do the job right the first time. Well, that's the stereotype, at least, as far as I know. I'm fairly well liked. Of course, I generally work with people that can do the job right the first time, so you know. My trade comes with a lot of cool gadgets, like a thermal camera to check for insulation leaks, an electromagnetic field detector to check for bad wiring, and useful knowledge about electrical, plumbing, air ducting, etc. These trade tools and skills ended up being the start of my current job. It started a few years back when my old buddy, let's call him Louis, and I were having a boys' night out at our favourite tavern. Louis is an accountant, married to a lovely woman, has 2 little kids he loves dearly, but he had a problem that was driving him nuts. They had recently moved into a new house, and his wife and kids were convinced it was haunted. Strange noises, flickering lights, cold spots, etc. All the usual sorts of phenomena that can usually be explained by loose ducts or pipes, bad wiring, and poor insulation. Louis had tried to convince his family that they had to be rational explanations for it all. But they were all so scared and so worked up, they had convinced himself it was a ghost, that they had to leave. All that nonsense. It was so bad, and kids were struggling with school due to lack of sleep, and Louis and his wife were constantly on each other's nerves. It was then I had the most brilliant idea ever, that I would later come to regret. I told Louis, hauntings are all about psychology. People think there is something to be scared of, so they get scared. It doesn't matter if the thing that they're scared of is real or not. Thus, I reasoned if fear could be caused by something thought to be scary, perhaps it could be cured by something thought to deal with the scary thing. I remembered seeing this tell-all story about a fortune teller once. She explained, people don't really want their fortunes told. They just want the good news, and they want to believe it. That's what she really did, figured out what her customers wanted, and put the big mystical show, and told them what they wanted to hear. I could do the same thing for Louis's family. So I proposed a plan. Go home, tell your wife and kids. Your friend the paranormal investigator is coming tomorrow to it psychologically. Then I'll go over the pipework, electrical, and whatnot. I'll help you fix whatever's really creating the bumps at night, and that should solve the haunting. Louis agreed. I arrived the next day to put on the show. I went for this whole Ghostbuster-esque science-based approach to occultism. I told Louis's wife and kids about my trade tools and how I used them for both home inspection and ghost hunting, and we made sort of a game of checking the house out. We laid down some newspapers, and the kids helped me draw protective words from magically infused salt, which was just table salt from a bottle marked with occult runes I found online. I made sure to draw real protection symbols because I knew the kids would look them up, just like I did. I burned some sage with a few nice-smelling herbs to mixed in to cleanse negative emotions and energies. Again, something I learned from YouTube. As I had expected, we found some old wiring that needed new insulation. EM fields can cause feelings of paranoia, a few loose pipes, and some old insulation that needed to be replaced. We got everything fixed up, and soon after, the ghost was gone. The paranormal investigator career should have ended there, but it didn't. Turns out Louis's wife was way into the occult and paranormal. I mean, she had special teas and crystals. She was part of the multiple paranormal related groups on Facebook, the whole 9 yards. And she had fallen for my act, hook, line, and sinker. She'd decided to tell all her friends about it, how I had saved her family from the ghost, and the next thing I know, I'm getting calls and messages from people asking me to investigate their hauntings. Now, I could have just ignored them, or explained it was all an act, but there was a problem. What would happen if the word got back to Louis's wife and kids that I was fake? I couldn't be sure, but probably nothing good. Of course, this was also an opportunity. What I was really doing with the Ghostbuster stuff, I was home inspecting, just with a bit of extra showmanship and improving. So I figured I'd run with it and tell people to call my company and schedule a home inspection, which was what I had to call my paranormal investigation work for tax reasons. And I'd just do the whole show and get paid to do my actual job. I didn't charge extra. Even if someone offered to tip me, I always turned it down. I made good money just doing my job. I didn't need extra. Well, at the time I didn't. I would come to regret not taking extra money after the pandemic hit. The unfortunate design flaw in the profession of home inspection is that you have to be able to go inside the homes to inspect them. If people were afraid of the deadly virus, that couldn't happen so much. After 3 months of not being able to do any jobs, the company I worked for went full belly up. Small town companies not being too big to fail. I was now unemployed, and trying to find a new job during a pandemic was like trying to squeeze blood from a stone. Financially, I would be alright for a while, but as of this writing, the pandemic is still going. And I've seen some reports that places are having second wave outbreaks, which says to me it's not getting fixed anytime soon. So, one day, I got a message on Facebook, someone trying to contact the company to schedule a home inspection. That's what we ended calling it. And found that the company was gone. I explained what happened, and that they had asked if they could just hire me directly, and maybe pay me under the table, if taxes are an issue. They were quick to add that normally they would never propose such a thing, but they feared for the well-being of their 2-year-old, and their spouse was serving overseas. Now, just so it's clear, the tax reasons, as you probably surmised, was just a cover on the part to explain why the professional paranormal investigator had a day job. Just another part of the act, really. I hesitated as I thought about how to reply to the message. Everything I had done so far was above board in terms of legality. I had been paid to inspect a home, and that's what I've done every single time. I just happened to do some other stuff as a free service to give families peace of mind. Of course, that wasn't an option anymore. I'll spare you the legal BS, but essentially I couldn't legally or certifiably do home inspections without being a part of a licensed company. The laws are weird here. Of course, there were no laws against selling a peace of mind. I had an N95 respirator as part of my trade tools, and I mean the real deal with replaceable filters and eye protection, so the virus wouldn't be a problem. What if I just went over and did my thing? Most of the little repairs I could do myself. Anything I couldn't handle, I could recommend a friend that could. And they needed work just like I did. All the Ghostbusters stuff would be technically free, so I knew I wouldn't be conning anyone. So I agreed to help. Turned out they had a lot of bad wiring and an infestation of mold that could cause hallucinations. It was no wonder they were seeing things. Well, the requests kept coming and I kept doing my bit. Things were fine until last Saturday, and my most recent case. Now, keep in mind, I had encountered some weird things while doing this job. Like one time, a ghost turned out to be a psycho that had been living inside the walls of the client's house. I just about screamed when I spotted him with my thermal camera. A few of the haunting cases turned out to be stalkers, and heck, there was this one time I had to knock out a punk with my monkey wrench when he tried to break in. This last case, though, even with all my experience, there were things I can't explain. I'll do my best to recount the events below. Okay, the client lived in this huge manor in a heavily forested area. It was a really old place, one of those turn-of-the-century constructions that had been added onto and updated over the decades. The clients were a family of 5. The husband, who I will call Winston, was a nurse. The wife, Dana, a school teacher, and they had one daughter, Janie, in her 20s, who was living with them because she lost her job during the pandemic. There was a 10-year-old boy, Raymond, and a baby boy, Oscar. Now, I'm sure you're asking yourself the same question I did when I first saw their home. How did they afford a huge manor-type place on those 2 salaries? Well, turns out there was a good reason, though I didn't discover it shortly before I began writing this. I pulled into the driveway and found Winston waiting for me. Even before I got out of my truck, I could tell he was on edge. Keep in mind, he was a big dude and well-built. He struck me as the type that could handle himself in a dicey situation. Yet his hands trembled as he waved me. I also noticed he had set down a lawn chair in a sheltered spot near the garage, which meant he felt more comfortable waiting for me outside on a cold, windy day, rather than inside his own house. Something must have spooked him good. I pulled on my mask and hopped out of the truck. But before I could even introduce myself, he jogged over to me and started talking up a storm. "Thank God you're here," was all I could make out before his speech delved into an overly excited nonsense and frantic hand-waving. It took me a few moments of my own gesturing to get him to calm down, enough that I could actually talk to him. "Winston, Winston, calm down. Ghosts feed on fear. You have to calm down or you'll just make it stronger." That was a popular theory within the ghost hunting community. It was one of those pearls of wisdom I used as part of my act. I hoped it would be enough to get through to him. Winston looked briefly alarmed, but began to settle down. I tried to encourage him. "Deep breaths. Relax. Where's the rest of your family?" I had been expecting 5, but only met him thus far. I had a sudden worrying thought that maybe the reason he was so panicked was someone was in immediate danger. Dana and Janie took the kids out. They'll be back later. I figured it would be safer if the kids weren't here for this. Winston explained, between ragged, slow breaths. "Honestly, if it weren't for the damn pandemic, we'd be all up in a hotel or something." He looked me up and down, sizing me up. "How can you be so calm when you deal with this paranormal stuff all the time?" He asked me in almost a pleading tone. The real answer is, I know this paranormal stuff is fake, but I didn't say that, of course. Instead, I shrugged and opened the side door of my truck. It's all about professionalism. I began calmly and methodically, equipping my gear as if everything was going on just as another day on the job. I'm supposed to be the expert, right? If I started panicking, then everyone else is going to as well, so no matter what, I never show fear. I get get scared, sure. I've had a few nasty encounters, but as long as I can act like I'm not afraid, I tend to not feel quite so scared. Fake it till you make it, like they always say. In truth, Winston's nervous deposition had me on edge, but true to my own advice, I wasn't showing it. He nodded slowly. Right, professionalism. Okay. He let out a long, slow breath. Alright, so tell me what's going on in your house. I made a big show of bringing my Ghostbustery gear, such as a bottle of magical salt, and I talked about it earlier, my photon buster, which was another prop I came up with for showing off to kids. It's a high-powered flashlight with an engraved lens. I had researched banishment runes online, and I scratched them into plastic, so the symbols are projected like the bat signal. There's so much, I hardly know where to start. He began with a sigh. Well, start at the beginning. What did you notice first? I prompted as we began walking to the front door. He struggled a moment as he tried to collate the contents of his memory. Well, it started with little things. We'd hear odd noises, felt cold spots, lights flickered. I had heard all that before, but the next part surprised me. So I had a buddy to come check the wiring and whatnot, assuming there was a mundane explanation. He found and fixed a few issues, but the phenomena, it didn't stop. That was the first time I'd ever done one of these, after someone had already done what I'd been planning to do. At the time, I reasoned the buddy might have been an amateur, thus hadn't found every issue, or maybe he didn't do the fixes right. Winston continued. After a while, we had gotten used to the little quirks, but things started getting worse. Objects would move when no one was looking, or on at least 3 occasions I set my coffee mug on the table, turned away for a moment, and found it tipped over and spilling out onto the floor. I thought maybe I'd knocked it over by accident the first time, but by the third, I knew I hadn't. I wrote off that one as clumsiness and denial. Sometimes people blame ghosts for losing their keys and wallets around. And it just kept getting worse, he continued. Soon we'd find paintings on the floor, furniture toppled over, books pulled off the shelf and stacked on the floor. He listed off a few more things, most of them I could write off as exaggerations. People forgetting to close drawers, or a bored 10-year-old trapped indoors, making a mess. I thought I had it all figured out, and then Winston dropped the bombshell. It got really bad when I opened the hidden room, and then there's what happened in the kitchen this morning. I paused, just short of the front stoop. Hold on. A secret room? What was that about the kitchen? Winston opened his mouth to speak, but he couldn't seem to find the words. After several moments, he finally said, "You'll just have to see it for yourself." He opened the door and gestured for me to enter. Unconsciously, my hand rested on the handle of my monkey wrench as I walked in. I didn't know what to expect now. I stepped through the threshold and immediately felt a chill run down my spine, causing me to shudder involuntarily. "You feel it?" Winston asked as he stepped behind me and closed the door, but he didn't lock it, as if he thought he'd need to get out in a hurry. "Chilly in here," I admitted. I heard a familiar beeping and realized my EMF detector was on and going utterly nuts. I turned it off, figuring there must have been some bad wiring on the doorbell or something. "Kitchen is this way," Winston gestured with a shaky hand and timidly began walking down the hall. We reached the kitchen. Winston stopped at the entrance and refused to take another step. I walked in and, well, it was just plain unreal. Someone had taken every knife from the butcher's block and shoved them in the 10-foot-high ceiling, hard enough to make them stick. Every drawer and cabinet was wide open, and every item, pots, pans, boxed foods, fruits, etc., was placed on the floor arranged by size order. The refrigerator, a huge 2-door model, which must have weighed at least 300 pounds, was upside down. As if someone had managed to lift the entire thing and flip it over. The doors were hanging open and the contents contents of the fridge had violently spilled out onto the floor in a sticky mess of broken eggs, milk, and juices. The mixture of fluids was smeared across the floor, up the wall, to the ceiling, as if a dozen hands had dragged the mess around. I blinked as I took in the scene. Most of it I could explain away, but the refrigerator, the knives shoved into the ceiling. Who or what could even do that? Winston's questions snapped me out of my confused stupor. Have you ever seen anything like this before? There was a frightened tremor in his voice. I could see the fear and the pain of having his home, his family's safe place, so violated in his eyes. Without really thinking, I answered out of reflex. Yes, twice. The first time it was staged. I had one guy try to debunk me, to expose me as a fraud, which I sort of am, I suppose. He set up a fake haunted house with various tricks and spooky events to make me think it was actually haunted. Of course, I ended up catching on to his plan, and his scheme failed. He did a lousy job installing some of his tricks. I ended up fixing a few of them for him. I might have thought Winston was trying to pull the same thing, but I could see the pain and fear in his eyes. If he was putting on an act, it was Oscar-worthy. I continued. The second time, I fell silent, as I thought about the moment I found the intruder hiding in the walls of a previous client's home. I felt the air in the room suddenly grow colder, and shivered involuntarily. I swallowed, and took a good long look around before turning to Winston and saying, "Have you called the cops yet?" Winston half nodded. "We've had to call them several times over the months. They came out a few times and checked the house top to bottom. They never found anything. I think it's just to the point that they're not taking me seriously anymore. I called them just before I called you, and they haven't arrived yet." It was time to get out. Whatever was going on here was beyond me. It would take at least 3 really strong guys to flip that refrigerator, and they might still be in the house waiting to strike. We'd call the cops again and wait for them outside. It's not safe in... I was suddenly interrupted by a woman's scream. It shattered the quiet like a hammer to a mirror. I felt my heart jump into my throat, and I had to swallow hard to force it back down. Winston's eyes shot wide open as he heard it. Then he called out his wife's name in terror. He turned to run towards the source of the scream before I could stop him. Dana should have still been out with the kids. It couldn't have been her. But I doubted Winston was in a proper mindset to realize that, of course. In fact, if it wasn't her, who or what the hell was it? I hesitated a moment, deciding between pursuing Winston, not wanting to let him face whatever threats there may be alone, or running outside to safety and calling the professionals to handle this. I ran after Winston, reasoning he was likely in immediate danger and I was the only one around that could help him. It was a struggle to keep up with Winston. He was in full-on panic mode, and I was carrying a bunch of heavy tools. I caught a glimpse of him as he turned the corner and began trotting down the stairs into the basement. I made to follow him, but paused for a moment as something odd caught my attention. The basement door was secured via a rope, so it couldn't be closed. One end of the rope was tied around the door handle, the other secured to a hook screwed into the wall. I puzzled a moment as to why it was like that, but soon Winston's frantic call for his wife down in the basement reminded me of the more pressing matters. I made my way down into the basement. The sudden chilliness in the air took me by surprise. I felt the need to rub my arms and warm them up. I found Winston running frantically around, opening cabinets, checking rooms, just tearing up the place while calling for his wife. "Winston," I cried out, "she's not here. Remember, she's out with the kids." He didn't even acknowledge me. I ended up having to grab him by both shoulders and shake him to remind him his wife could possibly be here. The veil of fear and madness finally lifted from his eyes. "But I heard her scream," he protested. "I heard her scream." scream too, but you already told me she took the kids away from here for safety's sake. She wouldn't come back until the problem's dealt with, right? My words seemed to sink in, and he relaxed and spent a moment trying to catch his breath. I was rather winded myself and leaned against the wall as I gasped for air. It was hard to take deep breaths in the mask, but I knew more or less how to. My eyes happened to settle upon something my brain couldn't make sense of. What the heck is that? I gestured to an opening in the basement wall. It was hinged like a particularly open door, but it looked just like a wall. There was no door frame or handle, just an angled section of wall leading to an open space behind. Without even having to look, Winston answered, "That's the hidden room we found last night. All the really weird stuff happened after we opened it." The air coming from the secret room smelled like stagnation and death, even through the mask, and I had just changed the filters, so how I could even smell was a mind-boggler. The inside of the room was darker than the moonless night, as if the light from the rest of the basement was unable to pierce its abyss. I used my thermal camera to look inside, but I didn't dare cross the threshold. The room was at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the basement, and I mean right up to the hidden door, which should not have been thermodynamically possible. With the aid of thermal vision, I could see the contents of the room. A table, large hooks hanging from the ceiling, a drain in the middle of the floor, a rack of butcher's tools. By this point, I had a dozen questions jockeying for my attention in my mind. The one that came to the forefront was, "Winston, why do you have this room in your house?" "I didn't know it was there, I swear," he replied defensively. I hadn't meant my question to be an accusation, but it must have come across that way. Just happened to find a hidden door cracked open last night, and I opened it to see the rest of the way and take a look inside. I'm pretty sure it's the source of the haunting. I stood there stunned, unable to form a coherent sentence as to speak. Was this real? Is this place actually haunted? Where had the scream come from? Was this all a setup? One in particular, though, had been at the back of my mind, demanding attention, suddenly came to the forefront. So I asked him, "Winston, why is there a rope keeping the basement door open?" In an almost offhanded manner, he answered, "It slammed shut on Janie. Once dropping her down here, some sort of force must have been holding it closed, because it took me, Dana, and a crowbar to get it back open, even though it doesn't have a lock." Above us, there was a loud tearing sound and a wooden slam. We were both startled by the noise and then looked upstairs. Sure enough, the door was now closed. I could see that part of the rope was still tied to the handle, hanging limp. Judging by the fraying two halves of the rope, it had been torn apart. Winston chanted, "No, no, 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 no," as he raced up the stairs and began shoulder ramming the door in an attempt to break it open. The air suddenly grew colder, so cold I could see the fog of my breath puffing through my respiratory vents. The lights began to dim and flicker, threatening to go out. I focused on staying calm, reasoning that all this could be some sort of test of, or the work of some home invaders, but all that went out the window the moment I saw the thing manifesting in the dark of the secret room. I couldn't really see it with my eyes, mind you. In fact, if it hadn't happened to look into the room with my thermal camera at that very moment, I might have never known it was there. I watched through the LCD screen as a swirling vortex of cold air formed in the room from seemingly nowhere and began gradually pulling itself into a monstrous human shape. It was at that moment I realized just how screwed we were. That was it. It was an actual haunted house. This wasn't someone's test. This wasn't a home invader's elaborate plan. Something I could not explain was happening before my very eyes. The inky darkness of shadows in the hidden room began to slither forth like tentacles of a creature from Lovecraftian nightmares. I was shocked, so dumbstruck and stunned at what was going on, I didn't even react till one of its tendrils touched my toe of my boot, and I felt a sudden icy coldness in my toes, like dipping them into a frozen lake. The pain was enough to snap me out of my stunned state and send me running to the stairs. When I reached them, I started climbing. I stopped due to some sudden inspiration and drew a line of salt, of protection, a symbol across the first step. I guess because I had done something similar so many times, it felt natural to do it in panic, or something. Winston was still banging on the door to try to get it open. I moved next to him, began slamming onto it with him. I tried the knob. It turned freely, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt as if something was holding it closed by pressing against the other side. The inky tendrils of darkness kept creeping towards us, the void seeming to swallow any light, maybe even the basement itself. Think of it as like a wall of pure black, slowly closing in on us. There was no way we could get out in time. The door was just starting to buckle, but we couldn't get it open fast enough. I had almost sat down and given up, but then the strangest thing happened. The darkness got to my line of salt and suddenly halted. I heard a frustrated roar echo from the depths of darkness as the hungry voice pushed against an invisible wall. Winston turned and saw the salt holding back the darkness, and he looked to me. "You're the actual real deal," he declared, a renowned vigor in his voice. "I guess so," I answered back. Redoubled my efforts. "Same time on 3, I suggested and indicated to the door. My partner nodded. 1, 2, 3. We slammed into the door, causing it to buckle and crack. 1, 2. I faltered as the stairs beneath my feet suddenly shook so violently, as if a giant hand had grabbed them and began thrashing violently. I looked back and realized the shaking was scattering the salt I had laid down. Our protective wall was crumbling. Winston looked back and realized the same thing. We exchanged a glance. At the same time we shouted, 3, and slammed into the door, busting through in the storm of splinters. We fell through and then scrambled to our feet. Winston slammed what was left of the door closed behind us and propped it closed with a chair wedged underneath the handle. I drew a wide semicircle of salt around the door and the chair, and quickly drew every useful symbol I could think of. I was startled by the door shaking as if it suddenly was struck by something on the other side. I almost stepped in the circle, which would have broken it. Thankfully, Winston was there to help me regain my balance. "How long will the salt hold?" he asked. "No clue," I answered. "Let's just get out of here." The light suddenly flickered and the floor beneath our feet began trembling as if there was an earthquake. The inky black shadow began oozing through the floorboards like rising floodwaters. I didn't have enough salt to cover the entire floor, so escape was our only option. We sprinted towards the front door in a panic. Winston was just screaming, asking, "What the hell is going on?" My only response was, "Just keep running." We made it into the hallway, and it was dark due to the lights going out. So I took a flashlight from my tool belt and flicked it on. We ran down the hall, but Winston suddenly skidded to a stop in front of me, and I accidentally ran into him. I was about to ask him why he halted, and then the answer became apparent. There were branches of shadows blocking the exit like a wall of hedge maze. We could see the front door and the safe haven of outdoors just on the other side of the barrier, but couldn't get through. Winston grabbed a potted flower off a nearby table and threw it at the barrier, maybe to break through or just out of anger. The pot shattered against the shadows as if it were a brick wall. I tried flinging my salt at it, but it didn't seem to have any effect. The wall of creeping darkness had already blocked the way we came, and the only door in the hallway we could reach led into a closet. I scanned around frantically with my flashlight, looking for any possible options when Winston suddenly grabbed my hand. "Your light! Shine it on the branches!" he shouted as he forcefully directed the beam. When the light touched the shadowy branches, they began to tremble and shrink. I didn't understand why at first, but then I realized I'd accidentally grabbed my photon blaster flashlight. Any branches touched by the projected banishing rune were withering away as if being touched by a flame. Just before the encroaching wall of darkness darkness could reach us, we burned a hole through the blockade and slammed through the front door. Never had the warmth of daylight felt so good as we emerged from the haunted house. Winston's family had just pulled up in the driveway when we emerged from the nightmare. A woman, I presumed to be Dana, exited her van and helped her husband off the ground. She looked and saw the wall of shadows chasing us. "What in God's name is that?" she screamed. Winston took hold of her and began directing her back to the van, shouting for his family to get out of there. They all quickly piled into the van and peeled out. I was right behind them in my truck. So, now we come to the present. To me writing this right now, Winston and his family are staying in my place. We're all fine. We've had some concerns about COVID, but frankly, compared to everything else that's happened, it doesn't seem like a pressing issue anymore. We tried calling the cops, but they didn't believe a word of what we said. As of right now, I'm at a loss. There is clearly some evil force running rampant through Winston's home. In fact, I did some research about the place and found some dark history. The manor was once the home of a serial killer back in the 1880s. He managed to avoid justice for years thanks to being the brother of the town's mayor. Eventually, the citizens of the town took justice into their own hands. They broke into the manor in the middle of the night and lynched him in his own kitchen. Over the decades, dozens of families had lived there, but never more than a few months at a time. Winston and Dana had been told by the realtor there were reports of the place being haunted, but at the time they didn't believe in the supernatural. To them, it was just old rumors that thankfully brought down the price of the home. Just enough for them to be able to afford it. I find myself scoffing as I write this. The American dream turned into a nightmare out of hell. Thus, I turn to the internet. To anyone reading this, Winston, Dana, and their children need help. They're looking to me to give it to them, but I don't know what to do. If there is anyone out there that can help in any way, please reply to this thread. I may be a phony, but I'm not heartless. I'm not leaving them to deal with this on their own. And that's our story. I hope you enjoyed our little venture into NoSleep and that you enjoyed that story. Again, it is the post and the credit is linked in the description. And I will see you guys for another spooky video soon. Bye bye bye.